The conquered king knelt before his throne for the last time as the warrior emperor slowly removed his own golden gauntlet, and what he did next made the entire enemy army watching from chains collectively scream in a sound that echoed across the valley for generations in local legend. He reached into the defeated king's mouth and pulled out his tongue with his bare hand and fed it to the war dogs while the man still breathed and watched his own flesh being devoured. This was not madness. This was calculated psychological warfare refined over centuries by rulers who understood that true power was not measured in armies but in the absolute terror your name inspired. The warrior kings of ancient empires did not simply defeat their enemies. They broke them in ways that ensured no one would ever challenge them again. What you are about to hear represents the darkest chapters of human leadership. These are ceremonies that were performed publicly to send messages that would travel faster than any messenger could ride. Every torture you will learn about today served a strategic purpose. Every scream was designed to prevent 1,000 future battles by destroying the will to resist before it could form. These kings built empires not just with swords, but with spectacles of suffering so extreme that surrender became the only rational choice for anyone who heard the stories. I need to warn you that this content describes historical violence with unflinching accuracy. The methods were real, and the suffering was documented by witnesses who never recovered from what they saw. The first ceremony was called the Forest of the Defeated, and it was performed by a king who conquered 17 kingdoms in a single decade of relentless expansion. After each major battle, he would order the captured enemy soldiers to be impaled on tall wooden stakes. The stakes would be planted along the roads leading into the conquered territory. The impalement was done carefully to avoid vital organs. Victims would survive for days on the stakes visible to anyone traveling through the newly conquered lands. As the king expanded his territory, these forests of impaled bodies grew longer. Travelers reported riding for hours through corridors of the dying and the dead. The psychological impact was so effective that 3 kingdoms surrendered without battle simply upon hearing that the king's army was approaching. Their rulers chose submission over risking the forest. The second ceremony was developed by a warrior emperor who believed that defeated kings should serve as furniture in his throne room for the remainder of their natural lives. Captured monarchs would have their tongues removed and their tendons severed so they could not speak or walk. They would then be positioned as living footstools beneath the emperor's throne. Visiting diplomats would be required to step on these former kings when approaching the throne. The humiliation was witnessed by ambassadors who carried the stories home. Some of these living footstools survived for years in their degraded positions. Their presence reminded everyone that even the highest could be brought to the lowest. The third ceremony came from a coastal empire whose king believed that the sea should consume his enemies as offering to the ocean gods he worshipped. Defeated enemy commanders would be sealed inside hollow bronze statues and thrown into the harbor. They would sink slowly while the air inside was consumed by their own breathing. The statues were designed with small holes that allowed water to seep in gradually. Death came slowly as the statue filled with seawater over the course of hours. Divers centuries later discovered dozens of these statues on the harbor floor. The bones inside told stories of final moments spent in complete darkness beneath the waves. The fourth ceremony was performed by a mountain king whose territory was defined by peaks that touched the clouds and valleys that never saw direct sunlight. Enemy kings would be taken to the highest peaks and exposed to the freezing elements. Water would be poured over them repeatedly until they became living ice sculptures. The frozen figures would remain on the peaks as permanent monuments visible from the valleys below. In winter, they were preserved perfectly for months. When spring came, the melting would begin and the figures would slowly collapse into grotesque shapes that reminded everyone what happened to those who challenged the Mountain King. The fifth ceremony was created by a desert emperor who controlled the only water sources across hundreds of miles of barren wasteland. Captured enemies would be staked in the desert just beyond reach of water. They could see the oasis where their captors drank freely, but they could never reach it. Death from dehydration took 3 days, during which the victims watched others enjoying the water that could save them. The psychological cruelty exceeded the physical suffering. Their bodies were left in the desert as dried husks that preserved for years in the arid climate. Travelers would pass these mummified warnings for decades. The sixth ceremony came from a king who believed that sound itself could be weaponized against his enemies and their descendants. Captured commanders would have metal funnels attached to their ears. They would then be positioned near massive drums that were beaten continuously for days without pause. The sound would destroy their hearing and eventually their sanity. By the third day, most victims were screaming for death in voices they could no longer hear themselves. Survivors were released back to their homelands as deaf madmen who could never again lead armies. Their presence demoralized their people more than their deaths would have. The seventh ceremony was developed by a warrior queen whose cruelty exceeded any of her male contemporaries and whose empire lasted longer than any of theirs. She would capture enemy kings and force them to fight each other to the death in arenas filled with her soldiers. The survivor would be granted a quick execution. The losers faced a different fate. Their bodies would be fed to pigs while their families watched. The pigs would then be released to the defeated kingdom as living insults. Her reputation for creative cruelty grew so vast that 5 kingdoms paid tribute for generations simply to avoid drawing her attention. Fear proved cheaper than war. The 8th ceremony came from an emperor who built the largest empire his continent had ever seen through methods that combined military genius with psychological devastation. Defeated cities would be forced to watch their walls demolished stone by their own citizens. The labor would continue until every fortification was completely erased. The citizens who destroyed their own defenses would then be marched to new territories as slaves. Their empty cities would be left as ghost towns that travelers avoided. These abandoned cities served as warnings visible from great distances. Their silence spoke louder than any proclamation about the cost of resistance. The 9th ceremony was practiced by a sea king whose fleets dominated trade, roots in whose revenge against those who challenged him became legendary. Captured enemy sailors would be tied to the hulls of ships below the waterline. As the ships sailed, the victims would be slowly consumed by marine life attracted to them. The journey would continue for days as the ships traveled between ports. By arrival, the victims had been reduced to bones still lashed to the hulls. Ports that saw these arrival displays never again considered resisting the Sea King's authority. The oceans themselves had become instruments of his vengeance. The 10th ceremony came from a steppe warrior whose mounted armies moved faster than any force in history and whose torture methods reflected his culture's relationship with horses. Defeated kings would be tied between horses that were then driven in opposite directions. The dismemberment was slow as the horses were controlled to maintain tension without immediate separation. The process could last for hours depending on how skilled the horsemen were at controlling their mounts. Crowds would gather to watch the gradual pulling apart. The remains would be sent to different corners of the defeated kingdom as proof that their ruler had been completely destroyed. Unity was impossible when the symbol of unity had been divided. The 11th ceremony was created by a jungle king whose territory was defended as much by nature as by armies, and who used the jungle's creatures as tools. Enemy commanders would be coated with substances that attracted jungle predators. They would then be released into the forest with just enough restraint to prevent escape. The sounds of their deaths would echo through the canopy as various predators discovered them. Guards would document exactly how long each victim survived. Stories of these deaths spread through neighboring kingdoms. Warriors who feared no human enemy became terrified of fighting a king who commanded the jungle itself. The 12th ceremony was performed by a king who considered himself divine and believed that enemies should be transformed into demonstrations of his godlike power. Captured kings would be suspended in cages above his throne room. They would remain there for months as living decorations that gradually weakened and died. The cages were designed to allow the victims to receive just enough food and water to survive. Their slow deterioration entertained the court for seasons. Foreign ambassadors would conduct negotiations while suspended kings moaned above them. The message was clear about what happened to those who opposed divine will. The 13th ceremony came from an island kingdom whose naval power dominated surrounding waters and whose king believed that water should be both weapon and witness. Enemies would be locked in chambers that slowly filled with water over the course of 12 hours. The rising level was visible and inevitable, but the pace was agonizing. Victims could calculate exactly when the water would reach their mouths. The anticipation proved more torturous than the drowning itself. The chambers were positioned where other prisoners could witness the process. They understood their own future if they failed to cooperate completely. The 14th ceremony was developed by a warrior king whose empire stretched across frozen territories where cold was the constant companion of all who lived there. Enemies would be given a choice between quick death and a chance at freedom. Those who chose freedom would be released naked into the frozen wilderness. They would be given a head start before hunting parties were released to track them. Survival was theoretically possible but virtually never achieved. The hunts became entertainment for the court. Nobles would wager on how long each victim would survive and how far they would travel before being caught. The 15th ceremony came from a king who expanded his territory through a combination of military brilliance and terror that made resistance seem pointless. Captured cities would be required to select 1/10 of their population for execution. The selection process was left to the citizens themselves. The internal conflict created by this requirement destroyed community bonds more effectively than any external assault. Neighbors turned against neighbors in desperate attempts to survive. The selected victims would be executed publicly while the survivors watched. The guilt of having chosen who would die haunted communities for generations. The 16th ceremony was created by an emperor who believed that public humiliation was more devastating than physical pain. Defeated kings would be forced to parade through the capital wearing costumes that mocked their former power. They would be required to perform degrading acts before crowds. The humiliation would continue for days with different performances required each morning. The former rulers would be systematically stripped of all dignity. When the execution finally came, it was almost welcomed. Death ended the humiliation that had proven far worse than any physical torture could have been. The 17th ceremony came from a warrior queen whose armies conquered 3 empires and whose methods were studied by military leaders for centuries. She would select the most loyal generals from defeated armies and give them a terrible choice. They could execute their own king or watch their families die. Most chose to kill their kings with their own hands. The psychological destruction of being transformed from protector to executioner broke them completely. These broken generals would then be released to spread stories of what they had done. Their shame prevented any future resistance from organizing around them. The 18th ceremony was developed by a king whose intelligence network was as powerful as his armies and who understood that information was the ultimate weapon. Captured enemies would be tortured not for information but to create false information. They would be forced to sign confessions implicating innocent allies. These confessions would be sent to the allies, creating suspicion and conflict among those who might otherwise unite against the king. The disinformation campaign proved more valuable than any military victory. Enemies destroyed themselves through suspicion while the king watched and waited. The 19th and final ceremony combined elements of all previous methods into a spectacle of absolute dominance that took 3 days to complete. The defeated enemy nation would be forced to gather in their capital. They would witness their king subjected to a sequence of tortures representing each conquered territory. The progression moved through physical pain and psychological destruction and public humiliation. Each phase was designed to break different aspects of resistance. By the third day, the witnessing population was completely traumatized. They had watched their symbol of power destroyed in every possible way. These warrior kings shaped human history through methods we find almost impossible to comprehend. Their empires rose on foundations of absolute terror that crushed opposition before it could form. The ceremonies they developed were not expressions of madness, but calculated strategies refined over generations. Each element served specific purposes in maintaining power. Modern historians study these methods not to celebrate them, but to understand how power has been maintained throughout human history. The screams have faded into silence across the centuries. The empires built on terror eventually fell like all empires must. But the records remain carved in stone and written in texts that survive the flames of conquering armies. The truth cannot be completely erased. These warrior kings believed they were gods walking among mortals. They believed their power would last forever. They were wrong about eternity. But they were right that terror works as a tool of domination, at least for a time. We study their methods to ensure we recognize the patterns if they ever emerge again. Tyranny often announces itself through spectacles of cruelty. The warrior kings are dust now. Their thrones are rubble, and their names are curses in the lands they once dominated. But human nature has not changed since their reigns. The capacity for such cruelty still exists within our species. This is why we remember what they did. This is why we tell these stories. The darkness they embodied remains a possibility within human leadership. Only vigilance keeps it contained. Remember these ceremonies. Recognize the warning signs. Never allow such power to concentrate in hands willing to use it. The night of the warrior kings has ended. May it never return.